Morning of July 19, 2004, Salt Lake City woke up like any other day. No sirens. No breaking news. No one knew that in just a few hours, a story would begin, one that would haunt America for years to come. A man called the emergency number. His voice trembled, strained with worry. He said his wife had left home early that morning to go for a run, just as she did every day. But today, she never came back. She did not show up at work. She left no message. There were no signs of trouble at all except for her complete absence. The woman's name was Lori Hacking, 27 years old, and she was carrying a small life within her. She was described as gentle, disciplined, and someone who trusted her husband without question. That husband stood in front of television cameras, thanking the community, begging for help, and saying this was the worst day of his life. Hundreds of volunteers flooded the streets. Posters covered the parks. Helicopters circled overhead. The entire city believed this was a search fueled by hope. But while everyone was looking for Lori out there, the police began looking in a different direction. Tiny details. Timelines that did not line up. Words that seemed harmless yet collapsed when placed beside the truth. And then a question began to surface, growing clearer by the day. If Lori never left the apartment to go running that morning, then what really happened behind that closed door? From this moment on, everything you think you know about that perfect marriage would begin to unravel, piece by piece. Lori K. Soares Hacking was not the kind of person who drew attention when she walked into a room. She was not loud, not flashy, and never tried to make herself the center of anything. People who knew Lori often remembered her through very small details, the way she always arrived early, the way she carefully wrote everything down, and the way she listened to others with a rare kind of patience. At 2007 years old, Lori was living a life defined by order and planning, a life that seemed to be moving in the right direction. She worked in the financial field, a job that demanded precision and a strong sense of responsibility. Coworkers described Lori as dependable, someone who never missed a deadline and never left a task unfinished. But behind the dry numbers and spreadsheets was a deeply emotional person. Lori loved her family, cherished quiet evenings at home, and placed special value on her marriage. She believed in effort. She believed that if two people worked together, any obstacle could be overcome. Lori was stepping into a new chapter of her life. She was preparing to leave her familiar job, pack up her belongings, and move to another state to start fresh. Inside her was a life still very small, yet powerful enough to ignite simple but meaningful dreams. A new home, a complete family, a stable future. For Lori, these were not grand ambitions, but a reward for years of perseverance and trust. Beside Lori was Mark Hacking, the husband she had loved for many years. To the outside world, Mark appeared easy to like. He was charming in conversation, quick to smile, and always seemed eager to help others. Friends remembered him as someone with a good sense of humor, someone who would stop to help a neighbor fix something or patiently talk with children at his workplace. He did not come across as cold or distant. On the contrary, Mark inspired trust. Within his family, however, Mark carried the image of a son under intense pressure. He grew up in an environment that prized achievement, where degrees and career paths were treated as measures of worth. Everyone around Mark seemed to be moving forward, while he felt slower, more uncertain. But instead of admitting that, Mark chose to build a different version of himself. A more successful version. A more confident one. Someone worthy of admiration. To Lori, Mark was a gentle husband, attentive, and always speaking about the future with very specific plans. She believed him. She believed the stories he told. She believed that the man beside her was doing everything he could. That trust, cruelly enough, became the most dangerous gap in their relationship. Those on the outside looked at their marriage and saw stability. But behind the apartment door were things no one noticed. Stories that sounded reasonable but were never verified. Plans that sounded perfect but existed only in words. Lori was not blindly trusting. She asked questions. She observed. And when the pieces began to stop fitting together, unease quietly slipped into what had seemed like a peaceful life. What is frightening in this story is not a stranger, but intimacy itself. The danger does not always come from the dark, but sometimes from the person sitting across the dinner table. A relationship built on love, when resting on a foundation of lies, can become something unrecognizable until it is far too late. Lori entered that marriage with all of her faith. Mark entered with an image he wanted others to see. And between those two people, a silent distance began to grow day by day, a distance no one on the outside could see. And that distance would later become the key to understanding why a morning that seemed so ordinary would open the door to one of the most shocking cases in the history of Salt Lake City. On the night of July 18, 2004, the small apartment shared by Lori and Mark Hacking in Salt Lake City fell into a very different kind of silence. Outside, the city continued its familiar rhythm of a summer Sunday evening. Streetlights cast a pale glow against faded walls. No one knew that inside this seemingly ordinary space, a quiet confrontation was unfolding. Lori knew. Not vaguely, not by intuition. She had touched the truth. The stories Mark had told for years began to fall apart, piece by piece. The plans for the future, the promises about medical school, about a new life in North Carolina, suddenly felt fragile. Lori did not scream. She did not cause a scene. Those who knew her understood that Lori was the kind of person who faced reality in silence, thinking carefully and deeply. That evening, they still appeared in public as a normal couple. They still talked and smiled. They still stopped by their familiar convenience store. Nothing about them raised suspicion. But once the apartment door closed, there was no one left to perform happiness for. There were only two people, facing truths that could not be undone. Time moved slowly. After midnight, the apartment was lit only by the faint glow from the living room. Lori was exhausted. She went to bed, carrying thoughts she had not yet been able to sort through. Perhaps she was still weighing her options. Perhaps she still hoped things could somehow be fixed. For Lori, leaving had never been an easy choice. She had always believed in giving others another chance. Mark stayed behind. He did not sleep. He could not settle. There was no longer any escape from the lies that had stretched on for far too long. The pressure he had carried for years now collapsed into a single, suffocating span of time. There was no role left to play. No story convincing enough to tell. The future he had constructed was falling apart, along with the image of himself he had worked so hard to protect in Lori's eyes. Around the early morning hours of July 19th, while the city was still asleep, an irreversible decision was made inside that apartment. There were no witnesses. No cries for help carried outside. Only a heavy silence, as if the room itself were holding its breath. After that, everything happened with chilling speed. Mark began doing very specific things, with clear intent. Time was calculated. Actions followed a terrifying order. Not in panic, but in a state that felt more like completing a task that had to be finished before daylight. As morning light began to slip through the windows, Salt Lake City woke to what seemed like an ordinary day. And Mark Hacking stepped out of the apartment, carrying a story that had already been prepared. A familiar story. Around mid-morning on July 19, 2004, The emergency call from Mark Hacking was routed to the Salt Lake City Police Department. He reported that his wife had not returned after her early morning run. This was not an unusual type of call. An adult being out of contact for a few hours in a large city often begins with concern rather than suspicion of a crime. But from the very start, dispatch officers noted one important detail: the caller was not out searching. He was near their apartment. The first officers were sent to the Memory Grove area, where Mark said Lori usually ran. They searched the trails, the grassy areas, and the slopes along the canyon. There were no signs of a struggle. No personal belongings left behind. No one recalled speaking with Lori that morning. Everything was clean to an unusual degree. At the same time, another team headed to the couple's apartment to conduct what was described as a basic information check. When the door opened, the first thing the officers noticed was not chaos, but a heavy stillness. The apartment was tidy. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no signs of a rushed morning. On the table, everyday items were neatly arranged, as if time had stopped the night before. But for officers accustomed to entering hundreds of living spaces, that sense of normalcy was exactly what stood out. In the bedroom, the bed had been made with almost excessive care. The sheets were freshly arranged, a detail that did not match the account of a frantic morning following a wife's disappearance. In one corner of the room, several of Lori's personal items were still exactly where they belonged. Her purse, her wallet, her car keys. Things that someone heading out for a morning run would be unlikely to leave behind. The officers exchanged glances. No one said it out loud, but the same question formed in their minds. If Lori truly left early that morning, why would she leave all of these essentials behind? Outside, in the parking area, Lori's car was located in a position that did not match the initial description. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone taller than Lori. Inside the vehicle, there were small details that caused officers to pause longer than usual. Not clear evidence, but enough to be carefully noted, point by point. When they returned to the apartment, a familiar feeling began to settle in, one that comes with experience. The story they were being told did not match the space they were standing in. And in cases like this, that kind of mismatch is rarely accidental. By the end of the morning, the official search was still underway outside, with hundreds of volunteers and media coverage. But inside, for the officers who had first stepped into that apartment, the focus had already begun to shift. This was no longer just about finding a missing person. It was about confronting a larger, more dangerous possibility. Because sometimes, a scene does not need to be chaotic to be frightening. Sometimes, it is the silence and the unnatural order that signal most clearly that something has happened and that it does not fit the story being told. Immediately after the first doubts emerged inside the Hacking apartment, the investigation entered a different phase. It was no longer a routine search for a missing person, but a complex puzzle in which every detail had to be stripped down and every statement tested under the light of truth. Investigators began with the most basic element statements. Mark Hacking was asked to come in for questioning several times that day. At first, his story sounded smooth. Lori had left early that morning to go running. He woke up later, did not see her, and assumed she had gone to work early. When he could not reach her by phone, he began to panic. Each answer was delivered with a worried tone, but to seasoned investigators, emotion is never evidence. Police asked Mark to describe his morning timeline in detail. Each time window was written down. Each phone call was cross-checked. And it was here that the gaps began to appear. Sometimes, markers did not align with data from the phone company. Some actions he claimed to have taken to look for his wife were not supported by any witnesses who had seen him in those places. The discrepancies were small, but placed side by side, they formed a noticeable fracture in his story. At the same time, the investigative team reviewed security camera footage from nearby areas. Convenience stores, parking lots, apartment entrances, and the roads leading to Memory Grove were all added to the list. Hours of video were played and replayed. Slowly, the images began to tell a story that did not match the words. Some cameras captured Mark appearing in places unrelated to the search. At times when he said he was running through the park, footage showed him inside a furniture store. Purchase receipts were collected, confirming times and locations. None of this directly proved anything, but it significantly weakened the image of a frantic husband racing against time to find his wife. As suspicion grew, police returned to the apartment once more, this time with forensic specialists. Every surface was carefully processed. Small areas of the bedroom, the living room, and Laurie's car were examined in detail. Traces invisible to the naked eye were collected and sealed. DNA samples were sent for analysis, not to reach immediate conclusions, but to build a scientific, objective picture. Electronic data quickly became another focal point. Mark's phone was examined. Call history, text messages, location data, and even periods of inactivity were documented. The personal computer in the apartment was analyzed. Emails, documents, search history, all of it was entered into a system for cross-referencing. With technology, as the investigative circle slowly closed in, Mark Hacking understood that the net was tightening around him. He did not flee in any conventional way. He did not leave the city. He did not try to cross state lines. Instead, Mark chose a different strategy, quieter and far more dangerous, retreating into a state of psychological instability, presenting himself as someone no longer capable of facing reality. After an unusual incident on a city street in the early morning hours, Mark was taken to a hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. To many, this appeared to be a genuine mental health crisis. But to investigators, it was also a scenario that required careful scrutiny. They did not rush. They did not confront him head-on. Instead, they watched patiently, tracking every movement, every visit, every interaction. During the days Mark remained hospitalized, police continued their work behind the scenes. The evidence already collected was organized and arranged along a clear timeline. Electronic data, surveillance footage, conflicting statements, and forensic findings were assembled into a case file that grew thicker by the day. At the same time, investigators reached out to those closest to Mark, hoping that, in a more private setting, the truth might finally surface. Then came the turning point. During one hospital visit, under pressure from his family, Mark admitted to things he had never told the police. That information was quickly passed to his attorney, and from there, to investigators. This was not a pursuit involving car chases or helicopters, but a capture built on patience and psychological pressure. On August 2, 2004, Mark Hacking was formally taken into custody. There was no noise, no resistance. The moment the handcuffs closed marked the transition of the story from investigation to prosecution. Shortly afterward, the case file was submitted to the prosecutor's office. Prosecutors reviewed every detail, weighing the consistency. When Mark Hacking was taken into custody and the case file began to come together, the picture behind the crime finally came into full view. This was not a random act of impulse, nor the result of a brief moment of madness. Mark's motive had been built over many years, layer by layer, quietly and dangerously, like a house constructed on a false foundation. At the core of everything was a long chain of lies. Mark did not lie once or twice. He lived entirely within a different version of himself. He created the image of a top student, a future doctor, a husband carrying enormous responsibility on his shoulders. These lies were not merely for bragging rights. They were meant to hide feelings of inadequacy, the pressure of constant comparison, and the fear of being seen as a failure within his own family. With Lori, Mark was not only afraid of being exposed. He was afraid of losing the admiration and trust of the woman who had placed complete faith in him. Lori did not love Mark for titles or degrees. But Mark could not believe that. In his mind, if the truth were revealed, everything would collapse: the marriage, his self-image, the future he had never truly built. The final days before Lori disappeared were when the wall of deception began to crack. Lori asked questions. Lori checked facts. And for the first time, Mark faced the reality that there might be no way out. Not because Lori threatened him, but because the truth was closing in. Psychological experts would later conclude that Mark did not act out of hatred, but out of fear of exposure, a fear rooted in control and wounded pride, where the ego was pushed to its breaking point. In that state, Mark chose to preserve his image, even though the cost was irreversible. The truth behind the case, therefore, is not only the story of a marriage that fell apart, but the tragedy of a man who could not. After charges were formally filed, the Lori hacking case officially entered the trial phase, a stage where truth was no longer shaped by emotion or media images, but measured through evidence and legal argument. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy, because from the very beginning, this was not a case lacking proof, but one in which the truth had already been assembled, almost in full. Prosecutors presented to the court a tightly structured sequence of events, arranged carefully along a timeline. Mark's conflicting statements, surveillance footage, shopping receipts that did not align with his account of searching for his wife, DNA analysis results, and most notably, the admission Mark had made to family members, later confirmed through his attorney. Each piece of evidence did not stand alone, but reinforced the others, forming a logical picture that was difficult to dispute. The defense attempted to emphasize the defendant's psychological instability, arguing that Mark was not fully in control of his actions at the time of the crime. However, the court determined that the calculated behavior before and after the event demonstrated clear awareness of consequences. The planning, concealment, and prolonged pattern of deception were inconsistent with a claim of complete loss of control. Faced with the overwhelming weight of evidence, Mark Hacking ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. During sentencing, he stood before the court with a lowered voice, admitting that he had destroyed the life of the woman he once claimed to love more than anything. There was no resistance, no argument, only a truth that had finally been named. The sentence handed down was life in prison, with a minimum term as defined by Utah state law at the time. While legally within the established framework, the ruling sparked significant public debate, as many believed the minimum requirement was. When the trial came to an end, justice on paper had been carried out. But for Lori's family, it was not an ending. The loss did not conclude with the sentence, it continued into every day that followed. A daughter who would never come home, a child who never had the chance to be born, a future erased forever. The consequences of the case extended far beyond a single family. It left a deep mark on the community, forcing people to re-examine what they often assumed to be safest: marriage, trust, and the outward image of a person. The Lori Hacking case serves as a reminder that danger does not always come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from the closest person of all, within relationships built on absolute trust. The greatest lesson of this story does not lie in the crime itself, but in prolonged deception. A lie can begin very small, seeming harmless at first. But when a person chooses to continue hiding instead of confronting the truth, that lie grows, consuming both character and reason. The truth, no matter how painful, is always less dangerous than a life built on falsehood. The case also raises a deeper question about social pressure and expectations of success. When human worth is measured by titles and achievements, those who fall behind may choose to pretend rather than ask for help, but pretending is never a solution. It only delays collapse. In the end, the story of Lori hacking leaves behind a quiet but powerful reminder: true love does not demand perfection. It requires honesty. And when honesty is traded away, the price can be something no one has the right to take: the life of an innocent human being.